Yeah, that looks good.
Excellent. Okay, so first, what is loss and damage? Loss and damage isn't really a scientific or technical climate term. It's actually quite a general term. It was used in the climate negotiations. And what it means is when we have losses and damages that are the consequences of climate change that are beyond what people can adapt to. And that would be considered the hard limits of adaptation. Or perhaps there might be actions that a community could take to adapt, but they don't have the resources to access them, which is we see often in our development and humanitarian works. Those are soft limits. And here we can already see with these soft limits, hard limits, this is quite a malleable term. Loss and damage definitions will kind of be very broad and differ from place to place, depending on where those limits to adaptation lie. There are two kind of categories of loss and damage. Economic loss and damage, which I think is pretty obvious for us, losses of assets, damage to people's livelihoods, these kinds of things. But then there's also non-economic loss and damage. This is loss of heritage for indigenous communities in the Arctic, for instance, that are losing some of their traditional burial grounds, or loss of biodiversity, a loss of health. There's other kinds of loss and damage that are harder to quantify. Those are non-economic. In the Paris Agreement, there's text about loss and damage that says that we're aiming to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. These categories, again, like most things with loss and damage, can be kind of fluid and sometimes contentious. But generally, when we talk about averting loss and damage, we're talking about mitigation projects. So a financing modality for that might be a sort of something coming from a climate fund, investments from the private sector. If we're looking to minimize loss and damage, this could be early warning systems, anticipatory actions, could be adaptation projects or social protection disbursements. So minimizing is a kind of broader category, and I think AA fits pretty nicely into it. And finally, addressing loss and damage is something that often happens after the damages have already been incurred. So that might be humanitarian response, recovery finance, finance coming from solidarity funds, etc. So what kinds of loss and damage risks can anticipatory action minimize? We know that anticipatory action is, from our work, is actually just a pretty small piece of the puzzle between development and humanitarian action. There's a really small window for action, and there's not much we can do, but we can avert quite a bit of loss and damage, most importantly, loss of life. There's examples all over the world. One is people in Bangladesh who are able to evacuate themselves and their livestock before a major storm or flood. There's quite a few documented cases of this. Loss of livelihood. This might be more relevant sometimes to slower onset events where we have anticipatory actions. For instance, for herder households in Mongolia who were able to receive cash transfers and animal care kits during extreme winter conditions and protect their herd size. And also, here we go, something more intangible, a loss of dignity. In humanitarian action, we see often people in extremely difficult and undignified situations. So AA could actually help preserve people's dignity. For instance, in Cyclone Amphan in Bangladesh, again, people that had benefited from AA reported having better access to water, better conditions in their evacuation centers. They were better prepared. In Senegal as well, with AA projects that were supporting communities dealing with drought, the number of households that reported going without eating was reduced. So again, preserving nutrition, preserving health, preserving dignity. So at the Global Dialogue platform, we had a session on loss and damage in AA. I really hope you were there, but if you weren't, don't worry. A few outcomes that came out of it was that AA funding is really not systematically reaching the most vulnerable people, and that's where it should be directed. There was also a lot of discussion about how a more nationally led and comprehensive approach to AA would be needed to minimize loss and damage. Right now, a lot of anticipatory action projects are in pilot phases or project approaches, so feasibility ends up driving AA funding more than actual vulnerability or needs. One thing that came out pretty strongly is that finance is needed to support system building. So when I say system building, I mean we're not just needing finance for activation once an early warning occurs, but that we need to help with planning and capacity building for governments, for civil society, and that humanitarians with experience of anticipatory action could play a really important technical advisory role, capacity building support, providing support for impact-based forecasts, for instance, these kinds of things. And finally, anticipatory action really, really requires flexibility because there's a short window for action, and we don't have time to go back to our back donors and ask them to, if this is okay, if we can move funding from one budget line to another. So we need some really decentralized decision-making and flexibility in our finance for AA. So I mentioned that loss and damage is in the course of negotiations. The last negotiations were actually an emergency session when the negotiations of what was meant to be the final transitional committee negotiations, who are the committee who will be providing recommendations for the COP28, were not able to come to consensus. So they organized one final meeting, which was in its own right, again, contentious because it was really difficult to come to agreement. There's been a lot of red lines across lots of different countries, but some of the things that came out concretely from it is that the World Bank is invited to be the trustee of the Loss and Damage Fund. Whether this is transitional or a more permanent arrangement is yet to be seen. That the scope of the fund, again, it's kind of general terminology here, but it mentions to focus on priority gaps. So areas where we're not getting enough funding to minimize or address loss and damage. So that might be longer term recovery, reconstruction, addressing slow onset events like sea level rise or desertification. There was a lot of language in the last agreement that the fund should be coordinating with funding arrangements. So mentioning essentially acknowledging that the fund itself is not going to be the only source of funding for loss and damage finance, and that all these other instruments, be they insurance, humanitarian finance, AA projects, etc., should be well coordinated. How that can be done at a global level remains to be seen. And finally, there's an agreement to have representation of civil society, indigenous people, climate migrants, people who have experienced losses and damages on the new Loss and Damage Fund Board. So to inform this discussion, we put together a call to action. The call to action builds on what happened in the last Global Dialogue platform, and it's essentially just saying the main priorities that we would have as AA practitioners. This call to action is not static. This is why we all have you here today. We want your inputs here. So we'll be going through these in more detail in the breakout session. So please stay on for those breakout sessions. We want to hear from you. The first is that we need anticipatory action funding under the L&D fund, and we want that funding to be predictable. That means already outlined in national AA or loss and damage plans. Secondly, we want to have local ownership. There needs to be direct access modalities. We don't need loss and damage funding to be going through intermediary after intermediary. We want a direct access. And that could be for national governments. It could also be for local civil society. So we want to hear from you about this. 3, to focus on the most climate vulnerable countries and enable AA system building. So in places where there's a lot of vulnerability, there may not be the systems to deliver anticipatory action. So focus on both of these elements. And finally, to have a flexible funding mechanism with limited restrictions that responds to the breadth of evolving needs. So the next steps here at COP28, countries have to finalize and adopt their joint proposal for the L&D fund. And so that's why we're here today, is to provide guidance for who can and how they can access the fund. So thank you for your attention. If you have any follow-up clarification questions, please put them in the chat. And after the panel discussion, we'll have a bit of room for any clarifications.
I want now to start with the panel discussion. You've seen in the agenda, we have 4 speakers who again give a broader overview. And I would like to welcome Mr. Alper Aras from the UNDRR Regional Office for Asia Pacific. thank you for joining us. It's really great that you're here. I see that you are already on the stage. Could you, and as a first question, just a bit, again, a scene setting, could you elaborate a bit, what are the challenges to scaling up anticipatory action in developing countries to reduce loss and damages?
Thank you very much, Raymond, for having me in this very innovative meeting. I think that losses and damages are one of the most important problems for developing countries which are not equipped to cope with disaster that increase in severity and the frequency with climate change. And however, there are various difficulties in measuring loss and damage here, especially in measuring slow onset events and non-economic losses. In addition to this, for example, we are supporting the Ministry of Finance in Bangladesh to prepare disaster risk reduction financing strategy. And while preparing this strategy, we saw that if you follow the economic theory in preparing the disaster risk reduction, this theory sometimes led you to focus on only the high income level people because their productivity is higher than the low income level. For this reason, we decided to include the humanitarian dimension in our strategy. On the other hand, the methodologies need to be developed on how to measure or take these, or take, for example, slow instant and non-economic losses into account. In addition, it is very important to determine which data should be collected, both in measuring past losses and damage, and developing models how much loss and the damage the disaster will cause in the future. For the countries exposed to disaster, reducing losses and damage is of very vital importance for sustainable economic growth. And anticipatory action can play a very important role in this area. In this regard, the anticipatory action can be defined as a set of action taken to prevent or mitigate the potential disaster impacts before a shock. And anticipatory action, on the other hand, the only condition that the anticipatory action can play a major role in preventing human and economic losses, it should be designed correctly. But the biggest problem we face here is that the prediction models sometimes give wrong results because the climate change disrupts the trend of the disaster. For this reason, it is important to integrate the climate change into the prediction models, but it isn't very easy to integrate the climate change into our prediction models because we don't have past experience how the impacts the climate change are parameters. The other problem is that the governments are faced with various investment options that will reduce loss and damage, but the governments needs new tools to identify the most cost-effective investment. In this respect, I think that we should develop a new methodology to rank climate change adaptation and disaster risk investment or risk management tools. From my experience, I can say that the methodology the government now have isn't sufficient to rank the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction investment, including the risk management tools. In addition, it is important that the data is constantly updated so that the prediction models work very well. For this reason, it is important to use the latest advanced tools such as artificial intelligence. This is valid for the forecast models use. In order to properly design and implement anticipatory action, it is important to provide technical assistance to developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the negative effects of the climate change. In this regard, the anticipatory action should be integrated in the work plan of both programming and the financing level of the Santiago loss and the damage network. And finally, anticipatory action continue to receive only very small share of total climate and disaster risk funding. as this can be attributed to fragmentation and the lack of understanding between the climate, development, and humanitarian communities. And the cross-sectoral collaboration and the division of labor would be beneficial. And lastly, again, it is important that the international climate and development community also increase access to finance to the strengthening of capacity at the local level to support the development and the improvement of legal and operational capacities, as well as the improving early warning system, such as datasets, trigger threshold development, and risk communication. Thank you very much for your patience to listen to me.
Good. Thank you so much for your intervention there. I think that's a very good scene setting for the participants. I hope it works for everyone. I know that this space is at maximum capacity almost, so people will no longer be able to join, but if there are any other issues, please let me know. Nevertheless, I would like to move on, and it's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Andronel Reyes from the Government of the Philippines, from the Office of Civil Defense within the Policy Development and Planning Service. It's really great that you're able to join us here in this online space. And I know that the Philippines were just about to pass or at least develop the Bill of Imminent Disaster, right? And I was wondering a bit how the Bill of Imminent Disaster will allow the Philippines government and humanitarian partners to provide more effective anticipatory action. And then also as a kind of a follow-up, well, how does the Bill of Imminent Disaster allocate funding ahead of a hazard? Over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. Will I be allowed to share my screen? Yeah. Just for a quick. All right. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon here in the Philippines and to the countries in Europe. Good morning, and thank you for extending the invitation to us to share our proposed initiative here in our country to develop our policy on the proposed bill on the declaration of state of imminent disaster. So my name is Andronel Reyes, and I am from the Office of Civil Defense from the Government of the Philippines. And let me share with you, everyone, to everyone that our mother policy, which is Republic Act number 1121, um, became our primary disaster risk reduction management policy, which shifted our reactive approach into a proactive one. Um, and then it gave our local government units the premium to have the authority, autonomy to create their own DRM programs at the local level. Also, this policy adopted the all hazards approach in DRM. So one of the dictates of the said law is to incorporate the internationally accepted principles of disaster risk reduction management in the creation and implementation of national, regional, and local sustainable development and poverty reduction strategies, policies, plans, and budgets. So in 2022 came the Typhoon Rai or Typhoon Det, which triggered the government to propose a new policy in order to anticipate um, the effects of an impending disaster. So the dictates of the resolution made by the National DRM Council in our country is to facilitate and initiate the most appropriate national policy or legal agenda for the institutionalization of the declaration of state of imminent disaster. And here at our office, we initiated to to choose on drafting a bill, which is the most appropriate type of policy that will be able to solve the solution. And what the Declaration of State of Imminent Disaster means is that um, it is made in anticipation of a highly probable disaster due to projected catastrophic impacts that are severe enough to require funding to supplement local resources in preventing or alleviating damages and losses. So, what are the salient features of the bill? Um, of course, it allows for the opportunity for advanced declaration by the national or local disaster reduction management councils here in our country. It also provides the criteria for the declaration through adopting a pre-disaster risk assessment. Um, and of course, this is the most important is the immediate release of DRM funds enabled to activate AA measures or protocols. So this proposed policy, also aims to adopt the no regrets approach. Um, if ever there will be a change in the hazard forecast of an impending disaster, the no regrets approach policy will be adopted. So, what are the key takeaways for this policy and how it will help the government and our humanitarian partners? Of course, this will institutionalize and AA practices will be institutionalized over the country and officially recognized by law as one of the key DRM policies of the country. It will also be the first and noble historic legislation in our country and in the region. Also, um, the AA pilot practices of INGOs will now be realized throughout the country. And the existing challenges in the pilot implementation of our partner organizations will now be addressed as existing policies will now defer to the new law. Of course, the DRM funding before an impending disaster will now be secured um, to able to cater to the AA interventions of the government and organizations. And that would be all. We hope for this bill to be endorsed already this year to the Philippine Congress for their further vetting and approval as well as adoption in the future by the president. So that would be all, and thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much for that update. That is a really exciting AA bill. I think this is hopefully it sets also a bit an example in the region and beyond for other countries and governments to adopt something similar. I think that is very exciting. Good. Looking at the time, I know we have to move on, and I'm actually very excited that we also have from the government of Sri Lanka, we have from the Ministry of Environment and the Climate Change Secretariat, we have Ms. Jamani Kumarasinghe with us today. And I wanted to talk with you a bit more about Sri Lanka and from the climate change aspect. I was wondering, Sri Lanka's nationally determined contributions, the NDC, could you share a bit examples or recommendations on how the NDC links to anticipatory action and what financing is needed as part of a potential loss and damage fund? Over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good afternoon to all. And Mr. Raymond, thank you very much for organizing this event and all the organizers for inviting us for this forum. So, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, can hear you very well.
Of course. Yeah, as Mr. Raymond mentioned, actually Sri Lanka is, as you all know, highly vulnerable country to climate disasters. So at the same time, we updated our nationally determined contribution and pledged our country commitments in last year 2021. And actually we have addressed apart from the mitigation and adaptation sectors altogether, 6 mitigation sectors and 9 adaptation sectors. Cross-cutting, we have addressed the loss and damage sector separately. And actually we have actually identified 5 NDC actions. I mean, comprehensively to completely act on the loss and damages of the needs of the country. So in that case, actually, we have at that time we have identified we need to assess the loss and damage actually happening to the country, as mentioned by our earlier speakers, not only the economic losses, but the cultural losses and the social impacts as well. So in that case, actually the country, there's a need to assess the loss and damage, true loss and damage, in order to make our plans in the time to come. So we need actually, if we are speaking, we need the standardized methods and some assistance, technical assistance to assess these loss and damages for the country. So actually, the first NDC has captured that, that aspect, and conduct a gap analysis to assess the current status and understanding of loss and damages. So in the second NDCs, we tried to strengthen the existing weather and climate forecasting systems. So in that case, an integrated approach, a comprehensive approach with, targeting all the stakeholder institutions from the national level to the provincial level actors we have identified, and the organizational networks. Especially, we have some actors, especially, act in the field. Their participation and all these actions toward the loss and damage actions, and especially in the event of a disaster, from the national level to the field level, this assistance goes, and we are, ready to act on the that aspect as well. So set of stakeholder organizations, especially responsible for tackle the loss and damage sectors. For example, we are having a Ministry of Disaster Management. We are having a disaster management sector together with the Department of Meteorology and the local authorities, district level, and together with the tribe forces, and all those actors are in line with, addressing this loss and damage aspect. So an integrated approach to forecast this loss and damages are in operation right now, and we need to strengthen and integrated this forecasting and early warning system to cater the needs of the country in the time to come. So the third NDC is targeting at it's also interlinked to the data management system to record the losses and damage per sector, sectoral approaches. So the sectoral approaches, and we are targeting the provincial level data portals in order to get the right and timely information to act on the decisions of to plan the way forward. And the other thing is establish an overarching nationally appropriate functional institutional mechanisms. Actually, we are trying to strengthen this mechanism. We are trying to network in these institutions. We are trying to, establish some disaster management preparedness plans and these operational plans and some guidelines in order to make this as a comprehensive approach. So I think right now the country is well prepared with its action plans, especially regarding this National Disaster Management Plan that has been targeted for year 2023 to 2030, and some Disaster Management Act is there, some operational plans which is targeting at the national level as well as the provincial as well as the local authority level is has been placed, and together with this the institutional setup is as an umbrella. One organization or the Ministry of Disaster Management is looking after this aspect, together with the Minister of Environment, the Climate Change Secretariat, and some other partner organization, as mentioned before, is playing a big role with the comprehensive set of documents, guidelines, strategic plans, are supporting in this process. And actually, in this regard, a comprehensive risk management framework is the target of NDC 5, and it is again to have a comprehensive framework to ready the country to actually help some assistance to the vulnerable communities in the country is in place now. So I think we need some anticipatory activities that has been identified right through these documents, and at the same time the countries making a voice on climate justice for loss and damage. Maybe it should be in COP28. So as a Asian network, we would be able to make a voice on climate justice for loss and damage in order to operationalize this loss and damage fund in time to come. So even the foreign assistance is with the funding partners is trying to target or focus their actions towards this operationalize of this loss and damage fund, especially picking the actions from the full set of plans that has the country been prepared right now. So thank you very much. Okay.
Good. Thank you so much for that intervention. I think it's very, very interesting to see how Sri Lanka already moves ahead with this. And a bit conscious of time again, let's move on to our final panelist. I'm very happy to have here from the government of Bangladesh, Mr. Ahmadul Haq from the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, and there with the Cyclone Preparedness Program. Thank you for joining. I know we only have like 3-4 minutes left, but it will be great to hear a bit more about the Cyclone Preparedness Program because it helps the most vulnerable communities ahead of a cyclone. Could you explain a bit how the CPP receives fund from the government for these actions and if they are specifically allocated ahead of time? Over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. Good afternoon from Bangladesh. Thank you very much for asking me a very much pointed question. Before answering your question, I want to say something about our actions directly helps the most vulnerable communities to mitigate short-term loss and damage. We have early warning message templates according to the signal and cyclone stages. Latest remarkable development is that we are actually changing our early warning message according to the anticipatory action advisories. We are waiting for more localized risk information and directives in line with impact-based forecasting. Our anticipatory action as advisory disseminations, actually we are getting from the, you might have known, we already developed Cyclone National Early Action Protocols. We are incorporating those identified actions in our traditional awareness messages. And our shelter management, like road connection, accessibility, waste requirement, health, all are actually, we are mixing it in those through our National Early Action Protocol. We are review the list of evacuation support required evacuation support required people of the community also. About the funding, it is the reality in our government funding mechanism. We are still struggling for designated or dedicated fund for anticipated actions. All our funds are basically used as there are basic 4 components that does mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Though we are anyhow managing our funds for anticipated action, so we are working on and advocating with our government policymakers. Though I am from them, to allocate dedicated fund allocations. We think we will get it very shortly. In my institutional approach, fund is available in the commencement of the financial year ahead of time. We have the most significant thing is that we have freedom to allocate fund in anticipated actions. And so we are doing since last 2 years, early warning dissemination fund, volunteer movement, communication cost, signal, after signal, actually signal 4, evacuation support fund, we are also allocating to our field offices. We disburse our fund according to our anticipated action triggering. But one thing we are actually lagging behind, we have to prepare our own anticipated action fund disbursement SOPs. The fund, we actually we are. I have already asked another question: is our fund available for capacity development of volunteers? Yes, some steps are there, but we are to work more. Our anticipatory action interventions are already included in volunteer curriculum, and more importantly, one recent development, we incorporate anticipatory action in our field demonstration. I just link our some activities with Cyclone Mocha. Recently, we faced in the May 2023. It was a Category 4 cyclone. What went well according to our anticipated action is that the estimated exposed people was more than 2.3 million. But our pre-arranged safe premises helped effective sheltering of 100% people of the isolated, most dangerous St. Martin Island. And in Cox's Bazar, another significant development was there. Our district administration managed to pre-acquisition all hotel and motels to be used as shelters, and all stakeholders of business community engaged. So for this, actually resulted a zero loss of life, minimal loss of damage, no livestock loss reported. Though approximately 1,200,000 houses were totally damaged, that was beyond our capacity. But this is actually very well success of anticipatory action with local community. Thank you very much.
I will just walk now with you through the call for action. So this is a 2-pager that was developed with the dialogue platform, and it has basically 4 calls. The first one is make anticipatory action eligible under the loss and damage fund and ensure that additional funding is predictable. This is based on the insight or the discussion we had that the financing available for anticipatory action is still limited. It's insufficient and partially hard to access, especially for local actors, meaning local governments, national governments, civil society actors in country. And also the current discussions when it comes to loss and damage fund is not really explicit if anticipatory action can be funded under the fund or not. That explains basically this call. The second call is ensure local ownership through direct access modalities. So you can scroll down a bit when you come access the document. So what we are asking here is, someone deleted a bit text, okay, that countries can access funding for anticipatory action directly with the fund. For instance, we want basically that the fund has, for instance, a dedicated facilities that enables then country, to get funding for our own national anticipatory action plan, in particular for the system building of anticipatory action.